They saw his hoodie and assumed poverty. They saw his silence and assumed weakness. But the man they dragged bleeding down the aisle owned their entire future. This is how 60 seconds of injustice became a $2 billion lesson in respect. The sky over San Francisco was bruised purple at 6:47 a.m. when Elijah Nakamura signed the final page of the acquisition agreement. His corner office on the 43rd floor of 101 California Street felt less like a victory chamber and more like a cell he'd been locked in for 72 hours straight. The quantum computing deal with Nexus Technologies had taken 6 months of negotiations, 3 continents' worth of video calls, and more legal documents than any human should read in a lifetime. $500 million changed hands with the stroke of his Mont Blanc pen, and the only thing Elijah felt was exhausted. Across the glass table, 3 executives in identical Navy suits packed their leather portfolios with synchronized precision. The lead negotiator, a man named Harrington who smelled like expensive cigars and entitlement, extended his hand without looking Elijah in the eye. "Congratulations, Mr. Nakamura. Nexus is thrilled to have Titan Forge Capital as our primary backer." Elijah shook the hand, noting how Harrington's grip went limp the moment contact was made. That same hand had crushed the knuckles of his white associate an hour earlier during celebratory handshakes. The mathematics of respect, Elijah had learned, were rarely equal. The executives filed out, their Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble like a countdown timer. Elijah's assistant, a sharp woman named Patricia who'd been with him since the early days, appeared in the doorway holding a tablet and a protein shake. "Your car's downstairs. Flight leaves JFK at 9:15 p.m. I packed your bag. It's in the trunk. You've got the investor meeting in London tomorrow at 10 a.m. Greenwich time. Miss it and Titan Forge's IPO roadshow collapses." Elijah took the shake, grimacing at the chalky taste of artificial vanilla. $5 billion in valuation rode on him sitting in a conference room in Canary Wharf in less than 18 hours. The British Investment Consortium had made it clear: show up in person or watch your company's public offering die before it ever touched NASDAQ. Book me on Prestige, Seat 1A. "I need to sleep." Patricia's fingers flew across the screen. "Done. $12,000. That hoodie going with you?" Elijah glanced down at the charcoal cashmere Loro Piana pullover that had cost $2,400, but looked like something a college student might wear to a coding boot camp. The distressed Brunello Cucinelli jeans and limited edition Maison Margiela sneakers completed the ensemble of calculated invisibility. In boardrooms, he wore Tom Ford. On airplanes, he dressed like he had nothing to lose. Always. The drive to SFO took 40 minutes through traffic that crawled like a wounded animal. Elijah spent the time reviewing pitch decks on his iPad, his eyes burning from screen fatigue and too little sleep. The numbers blurred together: revenue projections, market penetration models, competitive analysis matrices. His phone buzzed with congratulatory texts from investors he'd never met in person, people whose fortunes now depended on his ability to make strangers believe in algorithms they'd never understand. The memory hit him sideways as the car merged onto the 101, 10 years old, holding his father's calloused hand outside the Pacific Heights Country Club. His father, Kenji Nakamura, had been an architect then, brilliant, visionary, struggling. He'd designed a modernist masterpiece for the club's expansion, a building that would eventually win awards in Grace Architecture magazines. But that day he'd been denied entry at the front door. The guard, a thick-necked man with a clipboard, had looked at Kenji's worn suit and weathered hands and made a calculation. "Employee entrance is around back, sir." Kenji had smiled, that sad smile Elijah would never forget, and placed his business card on the clipboard. "Please tell the board that their architect couldn't find the front door. I'll be withdrawing from the project." They'd walked away together, father and son, while the guard stood confused. In the car afterward, Kenji had turned to Elijah with eyes that held no anger, only instruction. Never fight on their terms, Eli. When they lock the door, you don't break it down. You build a better building and buy the whole block. 3 years later, Kenji died of a heart attack at 51, never seeing his son become the thing he'd dreamed, someone who owned the blocks, the buildings, the entire game. SFO Terminal 3 was a carnival of humanity at 3 p.m. Elijah moved through the crowds with his backpack slung over one shoulder, noise-canceling headphones already in place, though no music played. The TSA checkpoint loomed ahead like a bureaucratic guillotine. The agent at the document check was young, maybe 25, with the kind of fresh-faced authority that came from a uniform and a tiny amount of power. She glanced at Elijah's clear membership card, then at his face, then back at the card with narrowed eyes. "This yours?" "Yes, ma'am." She turned it over, examining the magnetic strip as though it might reveal a hidden truth. Behind Elijah, the line was growing. A white businessman in an Armani suit shifted impatiently, checking his Rolex. "Can you remove your hood, please?" Elijah pulled back the hood, revealing his face fully. The agent studied him for another 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours, then waved him through without another word. The businessman behind him stepped up, flashed his card without being asked to remove anything, and was through in 3 seconds flat. The metal detector beeped when Elijah walked through despite having emptied his pockets completely. The TSA agent, a different one, older and rounder, waved him aside. "Random screening, sir. Step over here." Elijah knew the statistics. Asian Americans were 3.2 times more likely to be selected for additional screening than white passengers with identical travel profiles. He'd read the ACLU report during one of his many sleepless nights, had even donated $2 million to their legal defense fund. But statistics didn't make the pat-down feel less invasive or the stares of other passengers less humiliating. The agent's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking waistband, ankles, running fingers along seams. Another agent unpacked Elijah's backpack with theatrical slowness, removing his MacBook Pro, his Bose headphones, his portable charger, his leather Smithson notebook. Each item was examined as though it might contain explosives or contraband. "What's this?" The agent held up the Patek Philippe Nautilus watch in its travel case. Platinum, $40,000, a gift Elijah had bought himself when Titan Forge's valuation first hit $1 billion. A watch. Expensive watch. "You purchased this?" "Yes." The agent opened the case, turned the watch over, held it up to the light. Other passengers in line were watching now, some with curiosity, some with barely concealed suspicion. The businessman from earlier walked past toward his gate, briefly making eye contact with Elijah before looking away. The agent called over a supervisor, a woman with gray hair and bifocals. They conferred in whispers, glancing at Elijah every few seconds. Finally, the supervisor picked up a phone, spoke into it quietly. Elijah checked the time on his iPhone. He'd been in secondary screening for 14 minutes. His TSA pre-check and clear membership, which cost a combined $350 annually for exactly this kind of expedited processing, were apparently worthless. "Sir, we need to verify some information. Can you provide proof of purchase for the watch?" Elijah's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "I don't carry receipts for my personal belongings. The watch was purchased at Tourneau in New York 2 years ago. You can call them if you'd like, but I have a flight to catch." "What's the purpose of your travel?" "Business meeting." "What kind of business?" "I'm the CEO of a private equity firm. We're conducting an investor roadshow for an IPO." The supervisor wrote something on a form, handed it to the younger agent. They repacked his bag with less care than they'd unpacked it, shoving items in haphazardly. The watch case was returned last, practically tossed onto the metal table. You're free to go, sir. Thank you for your patience. Elijah repacked his belongings properly, taking his time despite the pressure he felt to hurry. The principle mattered. He would not be rushed through his own humiliation. When everything was secure, he walked toward his gate with measured steps, feeling the eyes on his back like physical weight. The Centurion Lounge was supposed to be a sanctuary. Elijah had paid the $600 annual fee for the American Express Platinum Card, specifically for access to these oases of leather furniture and complimentary top-shelf liquor. But the breakfast service had ended 17 minutes before he arrived, a casualty of his extended TSA encounter. The lounge attendant, a middle-aged woman with a forced smile, gestured apologetically at the empty buffet. Sorry, sir, we're transitioning to lunch service. Should be ready in about 45 minutes. Elijah settled into a corner chair and opened his laptop. The IPO presentation required final edits, numbers to update, graphs to refine, arguments to sharpen. His phone buzzed. Patricia sending him the latest market intelligence on Titan Forge's competitors. He read through analyst reports predicting his company would revolutionize enterprise AI infrastructure, and other reports predicting catastrophic failure, the bipolar nature of speculation. Around him, the lounge hummed with the sounds of success, confident voices discussing deals, laughter over craft cocktails, the clicking of laptop keys composing emails that would move millions. Everyone looked like they belonged. Elijah wondered if he looked the same to them or if his hoodie marked him as someone who'd stumbled into the wrong room. Boarding for Flight 909 began at 8:35 p.m. Elijah was in Group 1, first-class passengers and top-tier elite members. He approached the gate agent, a young man named Bryce, according to his name tag, and handed over his phone with the mobile boarding pass displayed. Bryce scanned it, frowned, scanned it again. The screen beeped red. That's strange. Let me try manually entering it. Elijah waited while Bryce typed deliberately on his keyboard, squinting at the monitor. Behind Elijah, the line was forming. Other first-class passengers with their designer luggage and impatient expressions. Sir, did someone upgrade you? Like as a gift or something? No, I purchased this ticket. It's showing as a full-fare first-class ticket. Those are usually $12,000. Did you use points? I paid cash. Bryce looked at Elijah properly for the first time, his eyes traveling from the hoodie to the distressed jeans to the sneakers. The mathematics happening behind his eyes were visible. I'm going to need to verify this with a supervisor. This ticket class requires additional confirmation. A woman in her 40s materialized, her Prestige Airways blazer crisp and her expression professional but cool. She took over the keyboard, clicking through screens while Elijah stood there holding his backpack. Other passengers continued boarding around them, none requiring supervisor intervention. May I see your identification? Elijah handed over his driver's license. The supervisor examined it with the intensity of a gemologist studying a potentially flawed diamond, comparing the photo to his face multiple times. Mr. Nakamura, this ticket is valid. However, it's unusual for someone to pay full fare when there are sales and upgrades available. Are you sure you didn't make a mistake when booking? I'm sure. Is there a problem? The supervisor's smile was thin. No problem. Just doing our due diligence. With ticket fraud on the rise, we have to verify unusual purchases. You understand. She handed back his license and gestured toward the jet bridge. Elijah walked past, feeling the weight of her stare. The phrase unusual purchases echoed in his mind. What was unusual, the price tag or the person holding the ticket? The jet bridge was that strange liminal space between terminal and aircraft, all industrial gray and cold air. Elijah reached the aircraft door where two ground crew members stood chatting. They barely glanced at him. Crew entrance is around back, buddy. Elijah stopped. I'm a passenger. The crew members looked at each other, then at his boarding pass when he held it up, then burst into laughter. Oh, you're flying with us, not for us. My bad, man. Go ahead. Their laughter followed him into the aircraft where the entrance galley opened into first class. The cabin was all cream leather and brushed aluminum, each seat a private pod of luxury. Seat 1A sat in the front left corner, a throne of sorts with maximum space and minimum disturbance. Elijah stowed his backpack in the overhead bin and settled in, pulling out his iPad. The flight attendant working the forward galley glanced over as she prepared pre-departure beverages. She was in her mid-40s with dark hair pulled into a tight bun and the kind of efficient movements that came from 20 years of muscle memory. Her name tag read Vivienne Marchand. She said nothing to Elijah, but he caught her whispering to a younger flight attendant who'd just emerged from the aft galley. "Keep an eye on 1A. Something's not right." The younger woman, whose name tag read Lucia Fontana, looked confused. "He seems nice." Vivian's voice dropped lower, but Elijah's hearing was sharp. "Trust your instincts. People like him don't usually sit up here." The words hit like ice water. People like him. 3 words that contained centuries of assumption, judgment, exclusion. Elijah's finger hovered over his iPad screen, the IPO presentation forgotten. He thought about saying something, about confronting Vivian directly, about demanding to know what exactly she meant by people like him. But he'd learned long ago that engaging with bias only gave it more oxygen. He put in his headphones and opened the deck. First class continued to fill with the usual assortment of business travelers and wealthy leisure passengers. An older couple in matching Ralph Lauren took seats 2A and 2B. A tech executive Elijah recognized from conferences settled into 3A, immediately opening his laptop. Everyone moved with the casual entitlement of people for whom $12,000 airplane seats were routine. Then she arrived. Claudette Van Buren announced herself before she was visible, the sound of expensive luggage wheels and even more expensive jewelry preceding her down the aisle. She was in her early 40s, blonde in that expensively maintained way that required monthly salon visits and considerable chemistry. Her Hermes Birkin bags, Elijah counted 3, probably totaled $250,000. The Chanel suit was current season. The Cartier love bracelet on her wrist was stacked with others in a display of casual wealth. She stopped at row 1, looked at the seat numbers, looked at Elijah, and her perfectly microbladed eyebrows drew together. "Excuse me, you're in my seat." Elijah removed one headphone. "I'm sorry? I said you're in my seat. This is 1A. I always sit in 1A. Elijah glanced at his mobile boarding pass, then back at her. "I believe there's been some confusion. This is 1A and this is my assigned seat." "Perhaps you're in 1F? Claudette's laugh was sharp and short. "I am not a window person. There must be an error in the system. People like you get upgraded when there are cancellations, but I specifically requested this bulkhead for my back." The phrase again, "people like you." Elijah felt his chest tighten, but his voice remained calm. "Ma'am, I purchased this ticket 3 weeks ago at full fare. I suggest you check your boarding pass. You might be surprised." Claudette didn't even look at her phone. She raised one manicured hand and snapped her fingers toward the galley. The sound cracked through the cabin like a whip. "Flight attendant, now!" Vivienne Marchand rushed over with the practiced urgency of someone who dealt with demanding passengers for 2 decades. Her smile was professionally sympathetic as she approached Claudette. "Is there a problem, Mrs. Van Buren?" Mrs. Van Buren. So they knew each other, or at least Vivian knew who Claudette was. Diamond Medallion member, probably. 15 years of loyalty, hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue, the kind of customer Airline sent Christmas gifts. "This gentleman has taken my seat. I need him moved immediately. Preferably to the back, but I'll settle for him just being out of my sight." Vivienne turned to Elijah, her expression shifting from sympathetic to authoritative in the space of a breath. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Elijah handed over his phone. Vivian scanned it with the device clipped to her belt. The screen beeped green. Her eyes flicked to the display, and for just a moment Elijah saw something cross her face, surprise, maybe confusion. The screen was showing not just a valid first-class ticket, but a VVIP code, the kind reserved for airline executives, major shareholders, and people with extraordinary influence. But Vivian's training overrode whatever cognitive dissonance she felt. She looked at Elijah, at his hoodie and sneakers, and made a calculation. The customer in Chanel was known. The customer in streetwear was not. The mathematics of service. The boarding pass shows 1A, Vivian admitted slowly. However, Claudette's voice rose. However, nothing. Look at him. Does he look like he belongs in first class? He probably hacked the system. My father plays golf with your VP of operations. I have a gala in London tomorrow, and I need to be well rested. I cannot sleep knowing he's right there. Other passengers were watching now. The couple in row 2 had put down their magazines. The tech executive had paused his typing. The cabin felt smaller, the air thicker. Vivian's smile became strained. Sir, I think it would be best if we reaccommodated you. We have a lovely premium economy seat with extra legroom. I can even offer you a voucher for future travel as compensation for the inconvenience. Elijah's laugh was dry and humorless. Let me make sure I understand. You want me to downgrade from a $12,000 first-class seat that I purchased with my own money to accommodate her? He gestured toward Claudette. Because she doesn't like my appearance? You're causing a disturbance, sir. Elijah leaned back in his seat, folding his hands calmly in his lap. I haven't moved from this seat. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't done anything except sit here. She's the one who's screaming. Yet somehow I'm the disturbance. Vivian's jaw tightened. Sir, I'm asking you politely to cooperate. If you don't move voluntarily, I'll have no choice but to involve the captain. Then I suggest you get the captain. Because I'm not moving. Vivian's hand went to the phone in the galley. Elijah put his headphone back in and returned his attention to his iPad, though he wasn't actually seeing the presentation anymore. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. This was the moment he'd been trained for his entire life. The moment when compliance would be easier, when backing down would end the conflict, when being small would make everyone more comfortable. But he was done being small. The cockpit door opened 5 minutes later. Captain Sterling Whitmore emerged with the bearing of a man who'd spent 30 years believing his uniform granted him unquestionable authority. He was in his early 50s, silver-haired with a slight potbelly that strained against his white shirt. His jaw was square and his walk was a swagger. He took in the scene with a single glance. Young Asian man in casual clothes versus well-dressed white woman. The narrative wrote itself in his mind before anyone spoke. Son, we have a situation here. Elijah looked up from his iPad. Captain Whitmore. I'm Elijah Nakamura. I'm a paying passenger in my assigned seat. Before you continue, I'd appreciate if you'd verify the passenger manifest and my ticket details. Whitmore's eyes narrowed at being told what to do. Don't tell me how to run my aircraft, son. I've been flying since you were in diapers. Then you should be familiar with FAA Regulation 14 CFR 2 50.5, which prohibits removing ticketed passengers without cause. The captain's face flushed red. Don't quote regulations at me. My crew has informed me you're being non-compliant and causing a disturbance. Mrs. Van Buren is a Diamond Medallion member who's flown with us for 15 years. And I'm a paying first-class passenger who's done nothing except sit in my assigned seat. Claudette clutched her purse dramatically. Captain, I feel unsafe. He's been staring at me, threateningly. A voice came from behind, the tech executive in 3A. That's completely untrue. He's been on his iPad the entire time. I'm sitting right here and I can see everything. Whitmore spun around. Sir, I suggest you stay out of this unless you want to join him off the aircraft. The executive's mouth snapped shut. The older couple in row 2 suddenly found their magazines fascinating. The mathematics of bystander intervention, standing up for justice versus risking one's own comfort. Most people chose comfort. Whitmore turned back to Elijah. You have two choices, son. You can gather your belongings and move to the seat my crew has generously offered, or we can do this the hard way. Elijah stood slowly. At 6'2", he had 3 inches on the captain. Whitmore actually took a slight step back before catching himself. Elijah's voice was quiet, but each word landed with precision. Captain Whitmore, I'm asking you one final time to verify the passenger manifest and check the codes on my ticket. If you do that, you'll see information that might change your approach to this situation. For a moment, something flickered in Whitmore's eyes. Uncertainty, maybe. But pride and prejudice are powerful forces, and he'd already committed to his course of action in front of a cabin full of witnesses. Whitmore pulled out his phone and spoke into it. Dispatch, this is Captain Whitmore, Flight 909. We have a Level 2 disturbance in first class. Passenger is refusing crew instructions and intimidating other passengers. Requesting port authority immediately. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Elijah sat back down carefully, keeping his hands visible on the armrests. His mind was already 3 moves ahead, calculating probabilities and consequences. He'd given them every chance to de-escalate. He'd been calm, rational, legally informed, and it hadn't mattered. Claudette made a small, triumphant sound and settled into seat 1F, apparently willing to compromise now that she was getting her way. Vivian hovered nervously near the galley. Whitmore stood in the aisle with his arms crossed, blocking Elijah's exit as though he might try to flee. The cabin had gone silent except for the ventilation system's hum. Every passenger was watching, most with their phones out now. A teenage boy in seat 2B, Asian like Elijah, had his camera pointed directly at the scene. His fingers moved quickly across his screen, already uploading, already sharing, already broadcasting this moment to the world. Elijah met the kid's eyes and gave him the smallest nod. Whatever happened next, there would be a record. The truth would exist outside this metal tube. 3 Port Authority officers boarded 7 minutes later, their tactical vests and visible weapons creating an immediate atmosphere of threat. The lead officer was in his late 30s, thick-necked and stone-faced, with the name Hawkins on his uniform. He was followed by Officer Brody and a TSA air marshal named Diaz. Captain Whitmore pointed at Elijah. That's him. He's been aggressive and non-compliant. Mrs. Van Buren feels threatened. The officers approached slowly, hands near their belts. Hawkins spoke first. Sir, we need you to gather your belongings and come with us. Elijah kept his hands on the armrests. Officer, I'm a paying passenger in my assigned seat. I've violated no laws. This is a case of discriminatory removal based on my appearance and ethnicity. Sir, the captain has authority over this aircraft. If he wants you off, you're trespassing. Stand up. I'd like to speak to a supervisor or legal counsel before I'm removed. That's not how this works. Stand up now, or we'll remove you by force. Elijah's chest tightened. This was the moment, the point where resistance would be criminalized, where his insistence on dignity would be labeled aggression. He thought of his father walking away from the country club, choosing to retreat rather than escalate. But his father hadn't had 287 witnesses with cameras. His father hadn't had the power to change the entire system. Elijah stood slowly, reaching for his backpack in the overhead bin. Hands where we can see them. Hawkins grabbed Elijah's right wrist, yanking his arm down. Brody grabbed the left. Before Elijah could process what was happening, his arms were twisted behind his back, the pressure immediate and excessive. The hold is unnecessary. I'm cooperating. No response from the officers. They marched him forward, their grips like vices on his biceps. Elijah's shoulder screamed where Hawkins's fingers dug in. As they reached the curtain separating first class from business, Claudette's voice carried after them. Make sure he doesn't come back. People like that ruin everything. The walk through business class was a parade of judgment. Passengers looked up from their meals and laptops, their expressions ranging from concern to suspicion to morbid curiosity. Some lifted their phones, others looked away quickly, unwilling to be involved. The officers' radios crackled with static and codes. At row 18 in economy, Elijah's foot caught on something. A passenger's extended leg, a bag strap, a buckle in the carpet. He stumbled forward, trying to catch his balance, but the officer's grips prevented him from using his arms. He was falling and couldn't stop it. His right temple struck the edge of an overhead bin with a sound that made several passengers gasp. Pain exploded behind his eyes, bright and immediate. He tasted copper, the metallic tang of blood flooding his mouth from where his teeth had caught his inner cheek. Warm liquid trickled down the side of his face. "Stop!" a woman's voice from somewhere nearby. "You're hurting him!" Diaz, the air marshal, pointed at the speaker. "Ma'am, interfere with a federal officer and you'll be arrested." The officers hauled Elijah upright, moving faster now, their hands just as tight despite the blood visible on his face. Through the haze of pain, Elijah heard whispers around him. Some were sympathetic. Some were assuming he'd done something to deserve this. The narrative was writing itself in real time. They dragged him through the aft galley where two flight attendants pressed themselves against the wall. One of them, Lucia, looked horrified. The other looked away. The aircraft door was open, jet bridge air rushing in cold and metallic. At the threshold, Brody shoved Elijah forward. He stumbled onto the jet bridge, catching himself against the accordion wall. His backpack was thrown after him, hitting the floor and sliding. Vivian appeared at the door with a tight expression, tossing something else. Elijah's iPad in its leather case. It landed hard enough that he heard the case crack. "And don't try rebooking," Whitmore's voice boomed from inside the aircraft. "You're banned from Prestige Airways for life, you hear me? For life." Elijah straightened slowly, touching his temple and looking at his fingers. They came away slick with red. His vision blurred at the edges, but his mind was crystalline clear. He looked past the officers to where the aircraft door was still open, where he could see directly into the first-class cabin. Claudette had a champagne flute raised, already celebrating her victory. Vivian was checking her watch, probably calculating how much this delay would affect their departure time. Whitmore stood in the cockpit doorway like a conquering general. Elijah's voice was quiet, but it carried. "Captain Whitmore, you're absolutely right." The captain paused, surprised he was being addressed. "I won't be flying Prestige Airways." He paused, letting the blood drip from his jaw onto his hoodie. "No one will." Whitmore's laugh was loud and dismissive. He slammed the aircraft door. The seal engaged with a heavy mechanical clank that echoed through the jet bridge. Officer Hawkins reached for his handcuffs. "All right. You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and interfering with a flight crew. Put your hands behind your—" "I need to make one phone call first. You'll call from the station. Turn around." Elijah reached into his hoodie pocket. The officers tensed, hands moving toward weapons. Hawkins actually half drew his sidearm. "Phone!" Elijah said sharply, pulling out the device slowly. "It's a phone. I'm making one call. You can arrest me after. But I promise you'll want to hear this." Something in Elijah's tone made Hawkins pause. It wasn't pleading or desperate. It was the sound of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what was about to happen. The officer's hand stayed near his weapon, but he didn't draw it. Elijah's phone wasn't a standard iPhone. It was a satellite device, encrypted, the kind used by government contractors and people who operated in spheres where standard communications weren't secure enough. He'd bought it 3 years ago when Titanforge started handling classified Pentagon contracts. Now he held it up so the officers could see he was just dialing. Nothing threatening, nothing sudden. One speed dial button, one ring. "Yes, Mr. Nakamura." The voice was crisp, British, efficient, the sound of old-world education meeting new-world precision. Alistair Pembroke had been Elijah's chief operating officer for 6 years, recruited from a collapsed hedge fund in London where he'd been the only person who saw the mortgage crisis coming. At 62, he was methodical, unshakable, and entirely loyal. Elijah stared at the closed aircraft door at the porthole window where he could see shapes moving inside. Alistair, I need you to remind me of our current position in Prestige Airways. There was a pause. The officers exchanged glances. Hawkins's hand moved away from his weapon, confusion replacing readiness. Titan Forge Capital Holdings owns 12% of Prestige Airways voting stock through various subsidiary entities, sir. More significantly, through our 2019 acquisition of Aero Lease International. We control the leasing rights to their entire Boeing 777 fleet. 41 aircraft comprising approximately 60% of their long-haul capacity. And their status on the debt covenants? Another pause, longer this time. They're 48 hours in arrears on their quarterly lease payments, sir. We've been extending professional courtesy. A 30-day grace period is standard industry practice. Elijah wiped blood from his jaw with the back of his hand. Revoke that grace period, Alistair. Invoke the default clause immediately. I want repossession orders filed with the FAA for every Boeing 777 leased through Titan Forge entities. I want them grounded. Now. The silence on the other end was profound. Then Alistair's voice came back, carefully neutral. Sir, that action will effectively ground 60% of Prestige's fleet. It will strand thousands of passengers. It will likely result in the airline's insolvency and bankruptcy. They just dragged me bleeding off Flight 909, Alistair. 3 officers, in front of 287 witnesses, to accommodate a socialite who felt I didn't look appropriate for first class. When Alistair spoke again, his voice had changed from neutral to steel. Understood, sir. I'm initiating the asset seizure protocol immediately. I'll contact our legal team, the FAA, and European aviation regulators. However, this will take approximately 45 minutes to process through official channels. I don't have 45 minutes. Flight 909 is pushing back right now. I want that specific aircraft stopped before it reaches the taxiway. That requires emergency intervention, sir. I'll need to contact the tower directly and invoke the safety authority clause of the lease agreement. It's aggressive. It's necessary. Do it. Yes, sir. I'll call you back when it's done. The line went dead. Elijah lowered the phone and looked at Officer Hawkins, whose expression had evolved from confusion to something approaching concern. You might want to radio the tower. In about 90 seconds, they're going to inform you there's a stolen aircraft on this tarmac. Hawkins laughed, but it sounded uncertain. You're out of your mind. Elijah checked the time on his phone. 85 seconds now. I'm patient. There's a difference. Inside the cockpit of Flight 909, Captain Sterling Whitmore was adjusting the throttle quadrant when the radio crackled to life. The rain had intensified in the last 10 minutes, streaking across the windshield in patterns that made the runway lights blur into ribbons of red and white. The tug vehicle had just finished pushing the Boeing 777 away from Gate 47, and Whitmore was running through his pre-taxi checklist with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this exact routine 7,000 times. That Asian kid had rattled him more than he wanted to admit. Something about the way he'd quoted FAA regulations. The calm in his voice despite being physically removed. But the decision was made, the passenger was gone, and now Whitmore just wanted to get this flight to London and forget the whole mess. Kennedy ground, Prestige 909 heavy, ready to taxi, runway 31 left. The response should have been immediate. Air traffic controllers at JFK handled dozens of aircraft per hour. Their responses were rhythmic, almost musical in their cadence. But now there was only static. Whitmore frowned, glancing at his first officer, Kyle Hammond, a younger pilot with barely 2,000 hours who still treated Whitmore like he walked on water. Kennedy ground, Prestige 909 heavy. More static. Then a voice cut through, but it wasn't the usual casual controller. This was the tower supervisor, and his tone carried the kind of urgency that made 30-year veterans sit up straighter. Prestige 909 heavy, hold position, do not start engines. I repeat, hold your position immediately. Whitmore's hand froze on the throttle. Ground, we're pushed back and clear. What's the issue? Prestige 909, stand by for priority traffic. Whitmore looked out at the taxiway. No aircraft were visible through the rain, no landing lights approaching, no other planes in their immediate vicinity. Ground, I don't see any traffic. We're good to taxi. The supervisor's voice came back harder. Prestige 909. Heavy, we have received an emergency asset repossession notification. Aircraft registration November 779. Papa Alpha, the lessor has revoked your certificate of airworthiness effective 2047 Zulu. Whitmore checked the clock on his instrument panel. 8:47 p.m. Eastern, 0047 Zulu. That was 2 minutes ago. Ground, check your systems. Prestige owns this aircraft. -909. FAA registry shows aircraft leased from Titan Forge Capital Holdings via Aero Lease International. We have a federal court order for immediate seizure. If you start those engines, you are committing a federal felony, operation of an unairworthy aircraft. Shut it down. The words landed like physical blows. Whitmore's mouth went dry. His hand trembled slightly on the throttle he'd been about to advance. Titan Forge Capital. The name triggered something in his memory. A magazine he'd glanced at in the airport lounge last month. Wall Street Journal. A profile piece on young tech billionaires who were reshaping finance. There had been a photo, a face he'd barely registered at the time. Young, Asian, intense eyes staring at the camera with the kind of confidence that came from knowing you'd won before the game even started. Kyle, pull up the manifest, seat 1A. Give me the name. Kyle's fingers flew across the iPad mounted between them. His face went pale in the glow of the screen. 1A. Nakamura. Elijah Nakamura. The color drained from Whitmore's face so completely it felt like his blood had stopped circulating. His vision tunneled. The instrument panel in front of him suddenly seemed very run away. Oh my God. Kyle was staring at him. Rick, who is that? Whitmore couldn't speak. His career was flashing before his eyes. Every commendation, every perfect landing, every promotion earned over 3 decades, and underneath it all, the mounting realization of what he'd just destroyed. Not just his own future, but potentially the futures of 17,000 Prestige Airways employees. The cockpit lights flickered, then the screens went dark. The flight management system, the primary navigation computer, simply shut off. Then the main power bus cut out. The entire aircraft plunged into darkness except for the emergency battery-operated floor lights that cast an eerie amber glow through the cabin. Kyle's voice cracked. What the hell? What's happening? Whitmore stared at the dead controls, understanding dawning with horrible clarity. They killed the remote link. They just bricked a $300 million aircraft from the ground. His hands were shaking now, gripping the useless yoke. Behind them, through the cockpit door, he could hear the rising panic from the cabin. Passengers screaming, confusion spreading like wildfire. My career. The words came out as a whisper. Kyle, what did I do? The first-class cabin had descended into chaos. When the lights died, Claudette Van Buren had been raising a glass of Perrier Jouet to her lips, celebrating her victory. The sudden darkness made her jump, and $400 worth of champagne spilled across her Chanel suit in a cold, sticky cascade. What is happening? I demand lights, Captain! But there were no lights except the dim emergency strips on the floor. The air conditioning's steady hum died, replaced by a suffocating silence broken only by the sound of nearly 300 people beginning to panic. The temperature immediately started rising, human bodies in an enclosed metal tube with no ventilation. Vivienne Marchand fumbled for the emergency flashlight mounted near the forward galley. Her hands were shaking badly enough that it took 3 tries to get it free from its bracket. When she finally got it on, the beam illuminated faces frozen in fear and confusion. Everyone, please remain calm. We're experiencing a temporary power issue. A passenger in 2B cut her off, the teenager who'd been filming earlier. Temporary? You just dragged off the guy who owns this plane. The cabin erupted. Passengers who'd been silent observers suddenly found their voices. Phones came out, their screens providing small pools of light that made the darkness around them seem deeper. Are you serious? Someone pulled up something on their screen. Holy, the guy in the hoodie? That was Elijah Nakamura? Who's that? CEO of Titan Forge Capital. It's all over Twitter right now. He just shut down the entire airline. The stock is down 34% after hours. Claudette stood frozen in 1F, champagne dripping from her designer suit onto the cream leather seat. Her phone was in her hand, but the screen showed no signal. The aircraft's Wi-Fi had died with the main power. This is absurd. Captain Whitmore will fix this. But Whitmore wasn't fixing anything. In the cockpit, he was staring at blank screens while his first officer tried desperately to get any system to respond. Nothing worked. The aircraft had been reduced to an expensive piece of aluminum furniture sitting on wet concrete. Lucia Fontana, the junior flight attendant who'd witnessed the entire confrontation, was in the aft galley crying quietly. A passenger from economy had made his way forward, an older black gentleman whose face was set in grim lines. I've seen this before in the 60s. Different uniforms, same story. You people never learn. Lucia looked up at him through tears. I'm so sorry. I should have said something. I should have stopped it. Yes, you should have. Now you get to live with that. 3 miles away in Terminal 4's curbside pickup area, Elijah Nakamura was sitting on a concrete barrier with a handful of napkins pressed against his temple. The bleeding had slowed but hadn't stopped. His hoodie was ruined, dark stains spreading across the expensive cashmere. Officers Hawkins, Brody, and Marshal Diaz stood in a loose semicircle around him. Their earlier confidence evaporated into something that looked like dawning horror. Hawkins's radio had been going off for the last 90 seconds straight. First it was the tower trying to reach airport police. Then it was dispatch. Then it was someone identifying themselves as the deputy commissioner of the Port Authority. And the urgency in that voice had made Hawkins's stomach drop. Unit 4-7, this is command. What is your current status with the passenger from Flight 909? Hawkins keyed his radio, glancing at Elijah. We have him detained outside the terminal. He's being cooperative, but we were preparing to transport him for booking on disorderly conduct charges. The voice on the other end rose in volume. Do not transport. Do not arrest. Do not do anything except release him immediately. Do you understand me? Sir, the captain requested. I don't care what the captain requested. We have the mayor's office on line 2, the governor's office on line 3, and a U.S. senator on line 4. They are all asking about Mr. Nakamura. Let him go. Now. Hawkins looked at his partner Brody, who'd gone pale under the terminal lights. Both of them were doing the mental calculation of what it meant. That multiple levels of government were intervening on behalf of someone they'd just physically assaulted. Sir, he's injured. We made contact during the removal and he's bleeding from the head. The radio went silent for 3 long seconds. Then the voice came back quieter, which was somehow worse than the yelling. Get him medical attention. Offer him whatever he needs. And for God's sake, apologize. Your union rep will be calling you within the hour. The line went dead. Hawkins lowered the radio slowly, looking at Elijah with something approaching fear. The man sitting on the concrete barrier wasn't some troublemaker who'd gotten what he deserved. He was someone with enough power to mobilize senators and mayors with a single phone call. Mr. Nakamura. Sir, we didn't know. Elijah looked up at him with eyes that held no anger, only calculation. You didn't know because you didn't ask. You saw what you expected to see and acted accordingly. He stood slowly, testing his balance. The world tilted slightly but steadied. He picked up his backpack, checking the contents. The iPad's screen was cracked but functional. His laptop seemed intact. The Patek Philippe watch case had a dent, but the watch inside was fine. I'll need your badge numbers for the civil complaint, and you should contact your union representative before your supervisors complete their reports. Brody found his voice. Sir, about the injury? I'll handle my own medical care. What you should be worrying about is the investigation into excessive force that's about to consume the next year of your lives. Elijah turned and walked toward the taxi stand, his gait steady despite the pain radiating from his temple. Behind him, 3 officers stood frozen, understanding that their careers had just ended on a rainy jet bridge because they'd chosen not to ask questions. The taxi ride to the Ritz-Carlton in Battery Park took 40 minutes through late evening traffic. Elijah spent it on his phone, ignoring the driver's concerned glances in the rearview mirror at the blood on his face. The internet had exploded in the 23 minutes since Officer Hawkins had grabbed his wrist. The teenager from Seat 2B, Theo Kazumi, according to the TikTok handle, had uploaded his video at 9:03 p.m. By 9:26 p.m. it had 6.7 million views and counting. The caption was simple. Prestige Airways drags Asian CEO off plane because racist Karen wanted his seat. He just shut the whole thing down. Watch what happens next. The video was damning. It showed Elijah sitting calmly in his seat, speaking in measured tones. It showed Claudette's shrill demands and Vivian's immediate capitulation. It showed Whitmore's swagger and dismissive attitude. Most importantly, it showed the violence. Hawkins's grip on Elijah's arm, the stumble at row 18, the sickening crack of temple against metal, the blood that followed. Twitter had picked it up within minutes. The hashtag Prestige Airways was trending #1 worldwide. Reddit's r/justice served had 3 threads on the front page, each with thousands of comments. Instagram influencers who'd had Prestige sponsorship deals were posting screenshots of termination notices and statements about standing with victims of discrimination. But it was the business media that interested Elijah most. Bloomberg had published a breaking news alert at 9:19 p.m. Prestige Airways stock halted after hours following emergency FAA grounding of aircraft fleet. Company representatives not responding to requests for comment. The financial implications were catastrophic. Prestige Airways had a market capitalization of $11.2 billion when the market closed. With 60% of their fleet grounded and no clear timeline for resolution, analysts were already predicting the stock would open Monday morning down 70 to 90%. Billions of dollars in shareholder value evaporating because a captain couldn't be bothered to check a manifest. Elijah's phone rang. Alistair, the aircraft is secure, sir. FAA has placed a hold order on the entire Prestige 777 fleet pending review of lease compliance. Flight 909 is still at the gate with no power. I've received 4 calls in the last 10 minutes from Prestige's general counsel trying to negotiate. Tell them I'm not available. I did. She said the CEO, Preston Thornwell, wants to speak with you personally. I'm sure he does. What's the stock doing? Trading was halted at 9:19 p.m. at $4.73, down 89% from today's close. When it opens Monday, I'd estimate it drops another 50 to 70% before hitting circuit breakers. 17,000 employees, Alistair. There was a long pause. I know, sir. This is going to hurt a lot of innocent people. It already has. I'm just making sure it doesn't keep happening. The Ritz-Carlton had a discreet medical service for guests who needed treatment without the publicity of an emergency room. By 10:15 p.m., Elijah was in his suite on the 38th floor while a doctor named Chen examined the gash on his temple with practiced efficiency. You need stitches. 4, maybe 5. I can do it here if you'd like to avoid a hospital visit. Please. The doctor worked in silence, applying local anesthetic before beginning the sutures. Each pull of thread was precise. When he finished, he applied a butterfly bandage and stepped back. You should rest. No screens for at least 12 hours. You likely have a mild concussion, and I'd recommend filing a police report about the assault. Already done. After the doctor left, Elijah stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty was illuminated in the distance, torch raised toward the sky. His father had loved that statue, had taken Elijah to see it when he was 7 years old. She's holding up the light so everyone can find their way home. That's what we do, Eli. We hold up lights in dark places, but his father hadn't lived long enough to see that sometimes holding up a light meant burning down the darkness around it. Elijah's phone buzzed constantly. Texts from investors, calls from journalists, emails from lawyers. He ignored them all except one. Patricia, his assistant, had sent a simple message. Your 10 a.m. meeting in London is aware of the situation. They're rescheduling to video conference tomorrow. They said take care of yourself first. The IPO roadshow that had been the reason for this entire trip, the $5 billion deal that had seemed so important 18 hours ago, suddenly felt very small. At 11:47 p.m., 4 hours and 23 minutes into their ordeal, the passengers of Flight 909 were finally allowed to deplane. But not through the normal process. Because the aircraft had no power, the jet bridge couldn't properly mate with the door. Ground crews had to manually position stairs and passengers had to walk down onto the wet tarmac in the rain, their expensive luggage getting soaked. Claudette Van Buren emerged near the front of the line, her Chanel suit ruined by champagne and sweat, her makeup streaked, her carefully arranged hair plastered to her skull. She was holding her phone up trying to get signal, trying to call her husband Preston, trying to understand how her simple demand for a better seat had turned into a global incident. A ground crew member, a young woman with rainbow hair and a clipboard, checked names against a list. Mrs. Van Buren? Federal agents would like to speak with you. They're waiting in Terminal 4. Claudette's face went white. Federal agents? For what? The crew member's expression was carefully neutral. I was just told to direct you to them, ma'am. Inside the terminal, 2 FBI agents in dark suits were indeed waiting. Not for Claudette initially, but for the crew. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez introduced herself to Vivienne Marchand with professional courtesy. That barely masked contempt. Ms. Marchand, we need to take your statement regarding the incident with passenger Elijah Nakamura. This is now a federal civil rights investigation. Vivienne's face crumbled. I was just doing my job. The passenger was non-compliant. We have video evidence from multiple sources suggesting otherwise. We also have records showing you were involved in 3 previous incidents where passengers of color were removed from first-class seating. All of those incidents resulted in settlements with non-disclosure agreements. Vivienne's hands were shaking. Those were different. Those passengers were actually... The agent held up a hand. Save it for your statement. You have the right to have an attorney present. Captain Whitmore was escorted through the terminal by airport security, his uniform stripped of his wings by prestige management before he'd even left the aircraft. 30 years of flying reduced to a security escort through his own workplace. Passengers recognized him. Phones came out. Flash photography followed him like paparazzi. A teenager called out, "Hey, You're the My Aircraft guy from the video. Whitmore kept his head down, but there was nowhere to hide. His face was already a meme, screenshotted and shared millions of times. His daughter had texted him 3 times asking if it was really him, if he'd really done what the videos showed. He hadn't been able to answer. Officer Hawkins spent the night writing reports, each word feeling like a nail in his own coffin. His union representative, a weary man named Sullivan who'd defended dozens of officers through disciplinary procedures, sat across from him in the Port Authority's administrative offices, shaking his head. Garrett, I'm going to be straight with you. The video is devastating. You grabbed an injured man who was complying. The optics are terrible and the law is worse. He was resisting. He was sitting. Then he was walking. At no point in that video does he resist. He stumbles because you're dragging him, and instead of steadying him, you push harder. That's excessive force. And because the victim is a high-profile CEO with resources for lawyers, this is going federal. Hawkins's career was over. He knew it. Sullivan knew it. The question now was whether he'd face criminal charges or just lose his pension and his job. Can I fix this? Sullivan's look was pitying. You can cooperate fully with the investigation. You can take whatever deal they offer. And you can pray that Mr. Nakamura is more interested in systemic change than personal revenge. At Prestige Airways headquarters in Dallas, the night had brought no relief. CEO Preston Thornwell had been in crisis meetings since 9:30 p.m., and each hour brought worse news than the last. The board had convened an emergency video conference at 11 p.m. The conversation had been brief and brutal. Leonard Rothschild, the chairman and a man whose family name was on half the oil wells in Texas, had never raised his voice to Preston in 15 years. He was shouting now. How did you let this happen? How did we not know Nakamura owned our lease agreements? We bought the planes from Aerolease International in 2019. Thornwell's voice cracked. It was a standard arm's-length transaction. There was no indication Titan Forge was involved. Rothschild cut him off. Arm's length? The man owns 12% of our voting stock. He's been buying shares for months and we didn't notice, through subsidiaries with different names. How was I supposed to? It's your job to know. The CFO, Margaret Hayes, normally composed, was near tears. Preston, we have $347 million in bond payments due Friday. If we can't fly those 777s, we can't generate revenue. If we can't generate revenue, we default. If we default, it's over. Thornwell had spent his entire career building Prestige Airways into a premium brand. He'd survived the post-9/11 crisis, the 2008 recession, the COVID pandemic. But he'd never faced an adversary who could simply turn off his airplanes with a phone call. Get Nakamura on the phone. Offer him anything. $50 million, a board seat, whatever he wants. Margaret pulled up something on her tablet. Preston, I tried calling his office 20 minutes ago. His assistant played a recording, Chopin's Nocturne Opus 9 No. 2, and then disconnected. Thornwell stared at her. He played us classical music? Margaret nodded slowly. And according to his lawyer, who called 5 minutes ago, Mr. Nakamura will see us Monday morning. Not before. He said to, quote, let them spend the weekend contemplating the consequences of their choices. The weekend was going to be hell. Already, passengers stranded by grounded flights were flooding social media with complaints. Travel bloggers were writing exposés about Prestige's history of discrimination. Employees were panicking about layoffs, and the stock, when trading resumed Monday, was going to crater. Rothschild's voice came through the video screen cold and final. Preston, I want your resignation letter on my desk by 9 a.m. Monday. You're done, but the board meeting was scheduled at your request to beg a man you humiliated. No, you're finished. We need to show Nakamura we're serious about change, and that starts with your head. The line went dead. Thornwell sat in his office alone, the lights of Dallas spreading out below him, and realized that in trying to remove one passenger from first class, he'd destroyed his own life. In New York, in a suite overlooking the harbor, Elijah Nakamura finally turned off his phone at 1:30 a.m. The London meeting had been officially postponed to the following week. The investors understood, or at least they understood, that making an enemy of someone who could shut down an airline with one phone call was bad business. His temple throbbed despite the painkillers. When he closed his eyes, he saw the overhead bin rushing toward his face, felt the impact, tasted the copper. But underneath the pain was something else. A cold satisfaction that justice, for once, hadn't required him to be silent or small or accommodating. His father's voice came to him across the years. Never fight on their terms, change the game. The game had changed. By Monday morning, when he walked into Prestige Airways headquarters, he wouldn't be asking for an apology or a settlement. He'd be taking control of the entire board, restructuring the company from the ground up, and making sure what happened to him never happened to anyone else. But tonight, he just needed to sleep. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and journalists and investigators. Tomorrow would bring the real work. Tonight, he let himself be a man who'd been hurt and who'd decided that being hurt wasn't enough. It was time to heal the whole system. Outside his window, New York glittered in the rain. Somewhere in that city, Vivienne Marchand was awake, worrying about federal charges. Captain Whitmore was staring at his blank walls, wondering how to tell his wife. Claudette Van Buren was discovering that all her friends' numbers suddenly went to voicemail. And on social media, millions of people were watching a video of a man being dragged bleeding from an airplane and deciding that maybe finally this time would be different. The video had hit 23 million views by midnight. By morning, it would be closer to 50 million. The teenager who filmed it, Theo Kazumi, had gained 200,000 followers in 6 hours. News networks were calling him for interviews. Documentary filmmakers were reaching out about licensing rights. But Theo wasn't thinking about any of that. He was in his family's apartment in Queens, watching his little brother Kenji sleep. Kenji was 9, Japanese-American like Theo, and had been asking lately if he'd ever be able to fly first class someday, or if that was only for certain kinds of people. Theo had told him everyone belonged everywhere. Now he had proof. Now he had a video of a man who'd been told he didn't belong, who'd been hurt for insisting on his dignity, and who'd responded by buying the whole airline. That was the story Theo wanted his brother to grow up with. Not the violence, not the humiliation, but the aftermath, the knowledge that justice was possible if you were willing to fight for it. By Sunday morning, the story had evolved beyond viral video into national conversation. Sunday talk shows debated airline discrimination policies. Legal experts analyzed federal civil rights law. Business commentators discussed corporate governance failures. And in 1,000 airport lounges across America, frequent travelers looked at the gate agents and flight attendants differently, wondering how many other Elijah Nakamuras had been removed quietly over the years. The number was 52. That's what Prestige's internal audit would eventually reveal. 52 documented incidents over 6 years, where passengers of color were removed from premium cabins under questionable circumstances. All had been settled with non-disclosure agreements. All had been buried in HR files that nobody at the executive level bothered to read. But Elijah Nakamura wasn't signing an NDA. He was hiring Sullivan and Cromwell, the most prestigious law firm in America, and he was subpoenaing every document, every email, every complaint that Prestige Airways had tried to hide. The lawsuit would be filed Monday morning, concurrent with the shareholder meeting where Elijah would reveal his majority stake. The charges would include assault, battery, false imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The damages sought would be $150 million. But money had never been the point. The point was making sure that the next time a gate agent saw someone in a hoodie with a first-class ticket, they'd remember what happened to Prestige Airways. They'd remember the airline that lost everything because they couldn't see past assumptions. In the Ritz-Carlton suite, Elijah spent Sunday reviewing documents with his legal team. His temple was bandaged, his head ached, but his mind was sharper than it had ever been. This wasn't just about one flight anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been made to feel they didn't belong in the spaces they'd paid to occupy. His phone rang at 4 p.m. Alistair. Sir, I have Preston Thornwell on another line. He's desperate to speak with you. Says he has a settlement offer. What's he offering? $25 million, full public apology, a seat on their new diversity advisory board, and termination of everyone involved in the incident. Elijah stood at the window, looking out at the city. Tell him I'll see him Monday morning at 9 a.m. in his office, and tell him to have the board there, all of them. Sir, he's going to try to buy you off. Let him try. It'll make what comes next more satisfying. Monday morning broke cold and gray over Dallas. At Prestige Airways headquarters, 7 board members sat in the executive conference room in various states of anxiety and anger. Preston Thornwell had his resignation letter ready but hadn't submitted it yet. Leonard Rothschild sat at the head of the table like a king whose kingdom was on fire. At 8:47 a.m., the doors opened. Security didn't announce him. Elijah Nakamura simply walked in, flanked by Alistair Pembroke and 3 lawyers from Sullivan and Cromwell. He was wearing a Tom Ford Navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, but his face still bore the butterfly bandage from Friday night's violence. The transformation was complete. The man who'd been dragged bleeding from an aircraft now stood at the head of the table, radiating the kind of power that came not from titles but from knowing you'd already won. Gentlemen, ladies, thank you for making time on short notice. Preston stood, trying to reclaim some authority. Mr. Nakamura, please have a seat. We've prepared an offer. Elijah remained standing. I didn't come for an offer, Preston. I came to take control of this company. He placed a thin leather portfolio on the conference table. Inside was a single document, and as the board members read it, their faces went from confused to shocked to horrified. Over the past 14 months, Titan Forge Capital has acquired 51.3% of Prestige Airways voting shares through 7 different subsidiary entities. As of this morning, I am your majority shareholder, which means every decision you make requires my approval, and I don't approve of how you've been running things. Leonard Rothschild's voice was barely a whisper. You can't do this. Elijah's smile was cold. I just did. Now here's what happens next. Each of you will resign effective immediately. You'll waive all severance packages and golden parachutes. You'll leave with your base pensions only, assuming those survive the restructuring. And you'll do it quietly, or I will spend the next decade hunting down every offshore account and every shell company you've used to hide your wealth. This is extortion. This is accountability. You created a corporate culture where discrimination was standard practice. You settled 52 complaints in 6 years rather than fix the problem. You trained your staff to see people like me as threats rather than customers. And when your systematic failures resulted in my assault, your first instinct was to cover it up rather than correct it. The room was silent. Margaret Hayes, the CFO, spoke up quietly. What about the employees, the 17,000 people who depend on us for paychecks? Elijah's expression softened slightly. I'm not destroying the airline. I'm rebuilding it. Effective today, Prestige Airways is being rebranded as Fairway Airlines. We're implementing mandatory bias training, body cameras on all crew, and third-party audits of every discrimination complaint. We're also giving every employee a 12% raise because dignity starts with fair wages. He turned to Alistair. Execute the liquidity injection. Get the ground crews back to work. Tell the FAA the hold is lifted on aircraft whose crews complete the new training. Preston's voice was broken. You planned this, all of it? No. I planned to fly to London for a business meeting. You forced me to plan this. The difference matters. Elijah walked toward the door, then paused. One more thing. Captain Whitmore, Officer Hawkins, Miss Marchand, and Mrs. Van Buren are all facing federal charges. I won't interfere with that process. But I am donating the proceeds from my civil lawsuit to organizations fighting discrimination in transportation. And I'm establishing a scholarship fund, the Captain's Chair, to help people of color become pilots. Because the best way to change who sits in first class is to change who's flying the plane. He left without waiting for a response. Behind him, 7 board members sat in stunned silence, realizing that they'd just witnessed a corporate execution performed with surgical precision and wrapped in the language of justice. Outside the building, reporters were waiting. Elijah had known they would be. Alistair had prepared a statement, but Elijah didn't need it. On Friday night, I was removed from Flight 909 for one reason. Someone looked at my appearance and decided I didn't belong. They were wrong, not because I'm a CEO or a billionaire, but because everyone belongs in the spaces they pay to occupy. What happened to me has happened to thousands of others who didn't have the resources to fight back. This lawsuit isn't about me. It's about making sure it never happens again. A reporter called out, "What message does this send to other airlines?" Simple. See people, not stereotypes. And if you can't do that, someone who can will buy your company and do it for you. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan was built in 1936. All granite columns and Art Deco grandeur, a monument to the idea that justice could be architectural. 8 months after Flight 909 sat dark on a JFK tarmac, Elijah Nakamura climbed those steps for the 3rd time in as many weeks. The media circus had only intensified. News vans lined Foley Square, reporters shouting questions that blurred together into white noise. Inside courtroom 18B, Judge Constance Morrison presided with the kind of quiet authority that made lawyers straighten their spines. She was 58, black, a former civil rights attorney who'd spent 2 decades in the trenches before President Obama appointed her to the federal bench. Her face revealed nothing as the prosecution called its final witness. The United States calls Keiko Tanaka. Keiko was 29 now, but she looked younger as she walked to the witness stand. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the Bible. She wore a simple gray suit and minimal jewelry, nothing that would distract from her testimony. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen, approached with careful courtesy. Ms. Tanaka, can you tell the court about your experience on Prestige Airways Flight 1847, February 14, 2024? Keiko's voice started soft but grew stronger. I was flying from San Francisco to New York for a presentation at the Museum of Modern Art. I'm an architect at Gensler. I'd purchased a first-class ticket because I needed to work on the flight and arrive rested. What happened during boarding? I brought homemade onigiri rice balls for the flight. Japanese comfort food. When I sat down, the flight attendant, Ms. Marchand, came by to check on passengers. She looked at my food and made a face. What kind of face? Disgust, she said. Keiko's voice wavered. She said, "What is that smell?" And then she said, "That's what people like you eat anyway, right? Maybe stick to our meals next time." The courtroom was silent. In the gallery, Vivienne Marchand sat between her court-appointed attorney and her ex-husband Roland, her face pale. How did you respond? I put the food away. I was so humiliated. The other passengers were staring. Some were laughing. I just wanted to disappear. Did you file a complaint? Yes. Prestige offered me $18,000 and a non-disclosure agreement. I signed it because I thought, her voice broke, I thought it was my fault for bringing ethnic food to first class. The defense attorney, a sharp woman named Beatrice Hoffman, cross-examined with precision. Ms. Tanaka, isn't it true that you voluntarily accepted the settlement? I was 27 years old and scared. I didn't know I could say no. But you did have the option? Legally, yes. Emotionally, I felt I had no choice. The next witness was Isaiah Washington, the retired federal judge who'd been removed from a flight 3 years earlier. At 67, he carried himself with dignity that even the witness stand couldn't diminish. His testimony was methodical, devastating. Captain Whitmore accused me of stealing a blanket. I'm a Purple Heart recipient from the Korean War. I served on the federal bench for 30 years, and he treated me like a common thief because I asked for an extra blanket and happened to be black. The pattern emerged across 5 witnesses, each telling variations of the same story. Different flights, different years, but the same underlying mathematics. Passengers of color removed from premium seating while white passengers watched or participated or simply looked away. When the prosecution rested, the defense called Vivienne Marchand. She'd aged visibly in 8 months. Her hair had gone grayer. The confidence she'd radiated on Flight 909 had evaporated into something that looked like broken comprehension of consequences. Ms. Marchand, did you intend to discriminate against passengers based on race? No, never. I was doing my job the way I'd been trained. And how were you trained? To prioritize our high-value customers, to manage conflicts quickly, to trust our instincts about potential problems. The prosecutor objected. Relevance? Judge Morrison overruled. I'll allow it. Continue. Vivian's attorney pressed. When you saw Mr. Nakamura, what were your instincts? I saw someone who didn't fit the profile of our typical first-class passenger. Young, casual clothing, no visible status indicators. I thought maybe there'd been a mistake with his ticket. And Mrs. Van Buren? I recognized her. She'd flown with us dozens of times. She was a known quantity. So you chose the familiar over the unknown? Yes. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brief but brutal. Ms. Marchand, you testified that Mr. Nakamura didn't fit your profile. What exactly was that profile? Vivian hesitated. Someone who looked like they belonged in first class. And what does that look like? I don't know how to answer that. Let me help. Did Mr. Nakamura's race factor into your assessment? No, not consciously, but unconsciously. Vivian's silence was answer enough. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman was a Latina woman in her 50s who'd taken careful notes throughout the trial. She stood and read the verdict with steady precision. On the charge of conspiracy to deprive civil rights, we find the defendant Vivienne Marchand guilty. Vivian's shoulders collapsed. Roland, sitting behind her, put his head in his hands. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant Captain Sterling Whitmore guilty. On the charge of excessive force, we find the defendant Officer Garrett Hawkins guilty. On the charge of filing a false police report, we find the defendant Claudette Van Buren guilty. Each verdict landed like a hammer blow. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks hence. Outside on the courthouse steps, Elijah stood before a wall of microphones. He'd chosen his words carefully over the weekend with his legal team. But now they came without hesitation. Justice today doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't undo the pain or the humiliation. But it sends a message that discrimination has consequences, that power can't protect you from accountability, and that the next person who looks at someone's appearance and decides they don't belong will think twice, a reporter called out. Mr. Nakamura, you've won. The defendants are facing prison. Prestige Airways is being dismantled. What more do you want? Elijah's expression was calm, but his words carried weight. I want a world where this trial never needed to happen. I want airlines where passengers are seen as people, not profiles. I want a transportation system where a hoodie doesn't make you a suspect. That's what I want, and that's what Fairway Airlines is going to build." The sentencing hearing 3 weeks later was standing room only. Judge Morrison had a reputation for thoughtful sentences that balanced punishment with rehabilitation. But these cases had drawn national attention, and the courtroom was packed with advocates, journalists, and former Prestige passengers who'd finally found their voices. Vivienne Marchand was first. She stood with her attorney, her hands clasped in front of her as the judge reviewed pre-sentencing reports. "Ms. Marchand, you had 20 years of service in aviation. Your record prior to this incident shows commendations for safety and customer service. But it also shows a pattern that you either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. You were involved in 3 documented incidents of discriminatory treatment. You settled each one quietly and apparently learned nothing." "Your Honor," Vivian's voice shook. "I thought I was doing my job. I see now that I was enforcing systems that hurt people. I'm ashamed. Shame is a starting point, not an end point. I'm sentencing you to 24 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years supervised release with mandatory community service and civil rights education." Vivian's knees buckled slightly. Her attorney steadied her. Captain Whitmore's sentencing was harsher. Judge Morrison's voice hardened as she addressed him. "Captain Whitmore, you had unique authority on that aircraft. You could have de-escalated. You could have checked the manifest as Mr. Nakamura requested. Instead, you called law enforcement on a compliant passenger because he didn't match your expectations of who belongs in first class. Your arrogance turned a seating dispute into a federal civil rights case. I sentence you to 30 months in federal prison, a $500,000 fine, and lifetime revocation of your commercial pilot's license. Additionally, you're banned from any employment in the aviation industry." Whitmore's wife, sitting in the second row, began crying quietly. Their son, a pilot himself, had stopped returning his father's calls 2 months ago. Officer Hawkins received the longest sentence. Judge Morrison's reasoning was clinical in its precision. "Officer Hawkins, you were called to manage a disturbance that didn't exist. When you arrived, you saw a man sitting calmly in his seat. Yet you chose force over conversation. You grabbed a compliant passenger, applied excessive holds, and when he stumbled, you pushed harder instead of steadying him. That push resulted in head trauma and bleeding. Your duty was to protect and serve. You failed spectacularly. I sentence you to 36 months in federal prison, permanent separation from the Port Authority, and forfeiture of your pension." Hawkins's face was stone, but his hands were white-knuckled on the table. Claudette Van Buren was last. Her sentencing was almost an afterthought, but Judge Morrison made sure it counted. "Mrs. Van Buren, you lit the match that started this fire. Your sense of entitlement, your assumption that your status mattered more than another passenger's dignity, your willingness to lie about feeling threatened. All of it contributed to a man being violently removed from an aircraft. I sentence you to 18 months in federal prison and a $150,000 fine, and I'm ordering that your name be placed on the FAA's prohibited passenger list for 10 years. You wanted Mr. Nakamura removed from your flight. Now you're removed from all flights." The civil trial that followed was almost anticlimactic. Elijah's lawyers had assembled documentation of every policy failure, every ignored complaint, every settlement designed to hide problems rather than solve them. The jury awarded $287 million in damages, $37 million compensatory, $250 million punitive. Elijah held a press conference the same afternoon. "I'm donating the entire award to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Asian Americans Advancing Justice. This was never about money for me. It was about making sure the next person who gets discriminated against has the resources to fight back." The systemic changes came faster than anyone expected. The FAA, stung by criticism that they'd enabled airline discrimination through lax oversight, issued emergency regulations within 6 weeks. The rule package, officially titled the Nakamura Protocol in internal FAA documents, mandated sweeping reforms. All Part 121 air carriers had to implement body cameras on cabin crew within 24 months. Quarterly bias training became mandatory, not the online modules that employees clicked through without reading, but in-person sessions with real scenarios and accountability measures. Third-party auditors would review all discrimination complaints, removing the conflict of interest when airlines investigated themselves. The Department of Transportation launched investigations into 19 other carriers based on complaint patterns that matched Prestige's. Congressional hearings followed. Senator Elizabeth Warren, chairing the Commerce Committee, made headlines when she held up a photo of Elijah's bloodied face. This is what happens when corporations prioritize profits over people. When discrimination becomes a line item in the budget, something to settle quietly rather than address honestly. The Nakamura case isn't an aberration. It's a symptom of systemic failure. The legislation that emerged, the Passenger Dignity Act of 2026, created federal causes of action for airline discrimination with treble damages. Airlines could no longer hide behind arbitration clauses or non-disclosure agreements. Victims had power and airlines had accountability. But the most profound changes happened in Dallas, in the building that had once housed Prestige Airways and now bore the Fairway Airlines logo. The transformation was more than cosmetic. Keisha Washington, the new CEO, stood in the same conference room where Elijah had taken control 8 months earlier. She was 47, a black woman who'd spent 20 years climbing through Delta's corporate ranks before Elijah recruited her. Her grandmother had been a Tuskegee Airman nurse. Her father had integrated an airline union in the 1970s. She understood viscerally what was at stake. The executive team she'd assembled represented a deliberate repudiation of the old guard. The new chief operations officer was a hijab-wearing Pakistani-American woman who'd revolutionized Southwest's logistics. The chief financial officer was a gay Latino man who'd turned around American's balance sheet. The chief people officer was a wheelchair user who'd sued 3 airlines before finding one that treated disability as diversity rather than liability. Their first priority was rebuilding trust with employees. Keisha held town halls in every hub city, standing on stages in airline hangars and hotel ballrooms, taking questions without filters or handlers. In Atlanta, a flight attendant with 30 years seniority stood up. Her voice was shaking but determined. I was trained the same way Vivian was. We all were. We were told to watch for certain behaviors, certain appearances. They never said discriminate, but the message was clear. How do we unlearn that? Keisha's answer was honest. You start by admitting you learned it. You stay vigilant about your own biases. You speak up when you see colleagues making the same mistakes. And you remember that every passenger deserves dignity regardless of what they're wearing or how they look or where they're from. The employee satisfaction scores told the story. Within 6 months of the restructuring, Fairway Airlines ranked #1 in the industry. Turnover dropped by 67%. Applications for pilot positions increased by 300%, with the biggest gains among women and people of color. The Captain's Chair Scholarship became a pipeline. Elijah had funded it with $50 million initially, but other donors joined. By the program's first anniversary, 673 students were enrolled in flight school, 89% of them women or minorities. The first graduating class included a former refugee from Somalia, a transgender Marine veteran, and a Navajo woman from the reservation where commercial aviation was almost unknown. Elijah attended every graduation ceremony personally. He didn't give speeches, that wasn't his style. But he shook every hand, looked every graduate in the eye, and said the same thing. You earned this. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The anniversary of Flight 909 fell on a Friday. Elijah had kept the date open deliberately, declining meetings and calls. He booked a ticket on Fairway Airlines Flight 909, JFK to London, departing 9:15 p.m., Seat 1A. The gate area was crowded when he arrived at 8:30. Business travelers with their laptops and roller bags, families heading to vacations, students with backpacks covered in stickers, the diversity of humanity that made air travel both chaotic and beautiful. At the gate desk, a commotion was unfolding. A businessman in an expensive suit was arguing with the gate agent, his voice rising with each word. "This baggage fee is ridiculous. Do you know who I am? I'm Executive Platinum. I spend 6 figures a year with this airline." The gate agent, a young Latina woman named Maya, remained calm. Her name tag identified her as a supervisor. She pointed to a small plaque on the desk that read, "Dignity at every altitude." "Sir, I understand your frustration. Our baggage policy applies to everyone equally. If you're over the weight limit, there's a fee. Your status doesn't change that." The businessman's face reddened. "This is absurd. Get me your manager. I am the manager, and if you continue raising your voice at me, I'll deny you boarding per our respectful travel policy." The businessman looked around, seeing other passengers watching. Some were nodding in agreement with Maya. Others had their phones out, ready to record if he escalated. The mathematics had shifted. Bad behavior now carried social costs. He pulled out his credit card with exaggerated frustration. "Fine, $5. Happy now?" Maya processed the payment with professional courtesy. "Thank you, sir. Have a good flight." As the businessman stalked away muttering, Elijah approached the desk. Maya looked up and recognition flickered across her face. She'd seen the videos like everyone else. She knew who he was, Mr. Nakamura. Her voice caught slightly. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything. My mother was a flight attendant. She quit after 15 years because of how passengers and management treated her. She doesn't have to quit anymore. None of us do." Elijah's smile was genuine. That was the goal. "You handled that perfectly, by the way. I learned from the best. We all study the videos from Flight 909 in training. They show us what not to do, but also what courage looks like." Boarding began on time. Elijah walked down the jet bridge, feeling the weight of the past year settling into something like peace. The aircraft was the same model, Boeing 777-300ER, but everything about it felt different. The crew greeted passengers with real smiles. The cabin felt less like a hierarchy and more like a shared space. In Seat 2A, a young boy sat with his mother. He was about 9, Japanese-American, wearing a Spider-Man shirt and clutching a gaming device. His eyes went wide when Elijah settled into 1A directly in front of him. The mother, recognizing Elijah, leaned forward. "Mr. Nakamura, I'm Yuki Kazumi. This is my younger son, Kenji, his brother Theo." "I remember Theo. He's the one who filmed everything." Yuki's eyes filled with tears. "Because of you, my sons believe they can go anywhere, be anything. Do you know what that means to an immigrant mother?" Elijah turned in his seat to look at Kenji, who'd been watching the exchange with wide eyes. The boy reminded him of himself at that age, uncertain whether he belonged in spaces like this, looking to adults for permission to take up room. "Kenji, is this your first time flying internationally?" The boy nodded shyly. "We're going to Tokyo to visit my grandparents. Business or first class?" "First class. Mom saved for 2 years." Elijah smiled. "You know what I've learned? It doesn't matter where you sit. What matters is knowing you have just as much right to be there as anyone else. Don't ever let someone make you feel small because of how you look or where you're from." Kenji nodded seriously, processing this wisdom like it was sacred text. Yuki mouthed "thank you" over her son's head. The flight attendant working the forward cabin appeared, and Elijah's breath caught. It was Lucia Fontana, the junior attendant who'd watched Vivienne Marchand's discrimination with guilt written across her face. She'd been promoted to lead purser, her testimony during the trial helping prosecutors establish the pattern of behavior that Prestige had cultivated. Mr. Nakamura. Lucia's professional demeanor wavered for just a moment. I'm glad you're flying with us tonight. I'm glad you're still here. I meant what I said. This was never about destroying jobs. It was about fixing a broken system. You didn't just fix it, you rebuilt it entirely. I actually love my job now. I don't go home feeling complicit in injustice. The aircraft pushed back smoothly at 9:17 p.m., just 2 minutes past scheduled departure. As the engines spooled up and the runway lights blurred past, Elijah pulled out his wallet. Inside, tucked behind his credit cards, was the original boarding pass from Flight 909, the one from a year ago. The paper was creased and worn. In one corner, barely visible, was a small dark stain where his blood had dripped. Next to it was a photograph he'd carried for years. Young Elijah, maybe 8 years old, standing next to his father at a construction site. Kenji Nakamura wore an architect's hard hat and had his arm around his son's shoulders. On the back, in his father's precise handwriting, "Never fight on their terms, change the game." Elijah had changed the game. Prestige Airways was gone, replaced by something better. 52 victims who'd signed NDAs were now free to tell their stories, and several had joined Fairway's advisory board. The aviation industry had implemented reforms that would prevent thousands of future incidents, and millions of people had watched a video that taught them a simple lesson. Assumptions about who belongs where are not just wrong, they're expensive. The aircraft climbed through scattered clouds into smooth air. Below, New York City spread out in a grid of lights, each point representing lives being lived, choices being made, systems either perpetuating injustice or dismantling it. Elijah closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to feel the moment fully. The hum of the engines, the slight pressure change as they reached cruising altitude, the knowledge that he was returning to the exact seat where everything had changed, but the entire world around that seat had transformed. Lucia's voice came through the PA system, warm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 38,000 feet. The captain has turned off the seatbelt sign. On behalf of everyone at Fairway Airlines, we're honored to serve you tonight." Elijah opened his eyes and looked out the window. The wings stretched toward the horizon, lights blinking at its tip, carrying them forward through the darkness. 2 years later, the changes had spread far beyond aviation. The Nakamura Protocol became a template for other industries. Hotels adopted similar measures after their own discriminatory practices came to light. Restaurants implemented bias training when social media exposed patterns of seating discrimination. Even retail stores began requiring body cameras after several high-profile cases of racial profiling. The cultural shift was harder to measure but impossible to ignore. A generation of young people had grown up watching the Flight 909 video in school, discussing it in ethics classes, writing papers about systemic change versus individual accountability. Theo Kazumi, the teenager who'd filmed it all, was now studying documentary filmmaking at NYU on a full scholarship. His thesis project was a feature-length documentary about the 52 victims and what happened to them after they were allowed to break their silence. Vivienne Marchand was released from federal prison after serving 18 months. She emerged to a world that hadn't forgotten, but was willing to let her prove she'd changed. She found work at a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated people reintegrate into society. Her testimony there was simple and devastating. "I spent 20 years thinking I was good at my job. I wasn't. I was good at enforcing discrimination efficiently. The difference matters." Captain Whitmore served his full sentence. His pilot's license was gone forever. His pension was gone. His marriage had collapsed under the weight of his choices. But in prison, he'd started teaching GED classes to younger inmates. One of his students was a black kid from Newark who reminded him, painfully, of how wrong his assumptions had been. When Whitmore was released, he didn't return to aviation. He couldn't. Instead, he volunteered at a youth center in South Dallas teaching underprivileged kids about science and physics. It wasn't redemption. Redemption wasn't something you earned back like a license. It was just an old man trying to do less harm than he'd done before. Officer Hawkins's fall was complete. Federal prison, pension forfeiture, a family that had distanced themselves so thoroughly he might as well have been a stranger. But in his third year inside, he'd written a letter to Elijah. It had taken him 6 months to compose. Mr. Nakamura, I don't expect forgiveness and I'm not asking for it. I just want you to know that I understand now what I did. I saw you as a problem to be solved instead of a person to be heard. I chose force over patience, assumptions over questions. I took the easiest path and it cost me everything. But more importantly, it cost you your safety and dignity. I'm sorry. Not because I got caught or because I'm in prison, but because I hurt you, and I was wrong. I hope you're healing. I hope what happened to you prevents it from happening to others. That's the only good that can come from my failure. Garrett Hawkins. Elijah had read the letter 3 times. He'd shown it to his therapist. Yes, he'd started seeing one after the trial, working through the trauma of being assaulted and the complex emotions of having that assault lead to systemic change. The therapist had asked if he wanted to respond. No, some things don't need a response. They just need to be acknowledged. But he'd kept the letter, filed it in a folder with other documentation from that night, not as proof or evidence, but as a reminder that even the people who'd hurt him were still people, capable of growth even if they'd never earn absolution. Claudette Van Buren had perhaps the hardest road. Her husband Preston had divorced her with swift finality, invoking a prenuptial clause about reputational harm that left her with minimal support. Her friends had evaporated, her social standing was gone. She'd served her sentence and emerged to find that the world she'd once moved through effortlessly had closed its doors. She'd tried to fly to Paris 18 months after her release, thinking perhaps enough time had passed. The gate agent had checked her name, made a call, and politely informed her that she was on the prohibited passenger list for another 8 years. "Ma'am, you're welcome to try other forms of transportation." Claudette had stood there in LaGuardia Airport, her single bag at her feet, understanding finally what she'd taken from Elijah, the simple freedom to move through the world without being stopped, questioned, judged. She'd spent 50 years with that freedom and never recognized it as privilege until it was revoked. She volunteered now at a homeless shelter, court-ordered initially but continued by choice. She was good at it. Organizational skills from her society years translated well to logistics of feeding and housing people. She didn't tell anyone her story, but sometimes the shelter residents recognized her from the videos. "You're that lady, the one from the airplane." "Yes. Must be hard. Being recognized like that. Harder than prison. Prison ended. This doesn't." The shelter's director, a formerly homeless veteran named Marcus, had told her something once that stuck. "You can't undo what you did, you can only outweigh it. Pile enough good on the other side of the scale that maybe eventually it balances." Maybe. Claudette wasn't sure she believed in balance anymore, but she showed up every Tuesday and Thursday, served soup to people who had far less than she ever had even now, and tried to remember that dignity wasn't about designer bags or first-class seats. It was about seeing people. On a cold Tuesday in November, 26 months after Flight 909, Fairway Airlines held a ceremony at JFK Terminal 4. Gate 47 had been renamed the Dignity Gate, and a plaque was being unveiled. Elijah had tried to decline. He didn't want monuments to trauma, but Keisha Washington had convinced him. "It's not about you. It's about everyone who comes after. They deserve to know that resistance is possible, that justice is achievable, that one person standing firm can move mountains. The plaque was simple bronze with raised lettering. Dignity Gate. On this jet bridge, February 27, 2024, Elijah Nakamura was forcibly removed from Flight 909 for refusing to surrender his rightfully purchased seat. His courage in demanding accountability led to the reformation of airline discrimination practices nationwide. This gate stands as a reminder. Every passenger deserves dignity at every altitude. The crowd for the unveiling was small by design. Elijah, Keisha, some Fairway executives, and a few special guests. Among them, Keiko Tanaka, Isaiah Washington, and Esperanza Delgado, 3 of the 52 whose stories had finally been heard. Also present was Theo Kazumi, now 20, his documentary camera recording for the film he was making, and his little brother Kenji, 11 now, who'd become something of a regular flyer as his family's circumstances improved. The mayor of New York spoke briefly about transportation justice. A representative from the FAA acknowledged the regulatory failures that had enabled systemic discrimination. And then Keisha invited Elijah to say a few words. He stood at the podium looking out at the small gathering, then passed them to the gate area where passengers were boarding for the afternoon London flight. Regular people living regular lives, most of them completely unaware that the gate they were walking through had been the site of something that changed everything. 2 years ago, I sat in seat 1A and refused to move. Not because I'm particularly brave, but because I was tired of being made small. What happened next, the violence, the trials, the reforms, none of that was planned. It was just the consequence of one simple truth. When you stand up for your dignity, you're standing up for everyone's. He paused, gathering his thoughts. The real heroes aren't the people who fight back when they have power. It's the 52 victims who signed NDAs because they didn't have the resources I had. It's the Keikos and Isaiahs and Esperanzas who suffered quietly and then found their voices. It's the Theos who recorded when they could have looked away. And it's the employees of Fairway Airlines who are building a culture where this plaque will seem unnecessary because discrimination will seem unthinkable. The applause was warm but brief. This wasn't a celebration. It was a memorial and a promise. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, Kenji approached Elijah shyly. "Mr. Nakamura, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Were you scared when they were dragging you off?" Elijah considered the question seriously. "Yes. I was scared of being hurt, scared of being wrong, scared that fighting back would make things worse. But I was more scared of teaching people that you're supposed to be quiet when you're being treated unjustly. Is that why you didn't yell or fight?" "Partly, but also because I wanted there to be no doubt who was in the wrong. If I'd fought back physically, people could blame me. By staying calm, the only story was their violence." Kenji nodded, processing this. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Elijah smiled, but his words were careful. "Don't be like me. Be better. I had resources and privilege even as I was being discriminated against. Use whatever advantages you have to help people who have fewer. That's how we change things, not one hero at a time, but everyone lifting everyone else." The boy's mother collected him, thanking Elijah again with eyes that still misted at the sight of him. As they walked away, Theo lingered behind. "I'm finishing the documentary. It premieres at Tribeca Film Festival next spring. Would you come? Only if it's not about me. I don't want to be a symbol. It's not about you. It's about what happened when people finally said enough. You're in it, obviously, but so are all 52 victims, so are the policymakers, so are the Fairway employees rebuilding a culture. It's about systemic change, not individual heroics." "Then yes, I'll be there." The sun was setting as Elijah left the terminal, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the aircraft parked at their gates. He'd never fully shaken the trauma. He still tensed when going through security, still felt his pulse quicken when boarding aircraft. The therapist said that was normal, that healing wasn't erasing what happened but integrating it into who you were becoming. His phone buzzed. Alistair texting about an acquisition opportunity in renewable energy. Titan Forge Capital had expanded significantly in 2 years, diversifying beyond aviation into sectors where they could apply the same principles: dignity, equity, accountability. But for tonight, Elijah wasn't thinking about business. He was thinking about the plaque at Gate 47, about Kenji's question, about whether the world his father had prepared him for was slowly becoming the world his father had dreamed of. "You don't change systems by being polite," his father had said once. "But you don't change them by being cruel either. You change them by being immovable, like a mountain that forces rivers to go around." Elijah had been immovable, and the rivers of airline policy, federal regulation, corporate culture, and social consciousness had all been forced to find new paths. His car was waiting at the curb. As he slid into the back seat, the driver glanced in the rearview mirror. "Where to, Mr. Nakamura?" "Home." The word felt right. Not his apartment, though that's where they were headed, but home in the larger sense, a country that was slowly, painfully learning that dignity wasn't a luxury good available only in first class. It was a human right that belonged to everyone, regardless of what they wore or how they looked or whether they fit someone else's profile of who deserved space. The car pulled into traffic, joining the flow of headlights and humanity streaming through New York City's arteries. Somewhere in that flow was a flight attendant heading to work who'd learned from Vivian's mistakes. Somewhere was a pilot who'd studied the Nakamura protocol and vowed never to abuse authority. Somewhere was a passenger who'd been discriminated against, but now knew they had recourse, resources, and a roadmap. And somewhere, in 1,000 airports across America and beyond, people were boarding aircraft without being stopped, questioned, or judged for not matching expectations. They were taking their seats, first class, business, economy, wherever, and understanding that they belonged there simply because they were human. That was the real change, not the trials or the sentences or the corporate restructuring. It was the quiet shift in consciousness, the slow recognition that dignity wasn't something you earned through status or wealth. It was something you were born with and that no one had the right to take away. Elijah closed his eyes as the car navigated toward home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fights, new systems that needed changing. But tonight, he let himself rest in the knowledge that one man refusing to move from seat 1A had helped ensure that millions of others would never have to.